Hey Goblin, you've been really practicing those war drums. I'll bring the generic Goblin noise!
This video is sponsored by Cool Stuff Inc. with free weekly content and free shipping on orders over $150. You can save 5% site-wide by using the promo code MTGMudsta. And 401 Games, Canada's one-stop shop for trading cards, board games, and hobby supplies. They've got an amazing loyalty program and an easy-to-use and robust buy list. And if you use the promo code MTGMudsta, your first purchase of MTG Sealed and Singles will be 5% off. If you're looking for a direct way to help the channel, please consider joining my Patreon and becoming a member of the Generic Goblin Gang. Hey gang, and welcome back. You better buckle up because this is a long one, with Chris, Reese, and Fred joining me. In today's game, Fred is playing his Jenson Carthalion deck, and his opening hand has Beast Within, Explorer, Ruka Rumel Biologist, Hallowed Fountain, Sliver Overlord, Carplusion Forest, and Xander's Lounge. Reese is up to no good with Demir, playing Malcolm and Nadier, keeping Supernatural Stamina, Tainted Isle, Academy Manufactor, Mere Battlesphere, Beacon of Unrest, and 2 Swamps. Chris is playing Queen Marchesa, Long May She Reign, keeping Boros Signet, Rugged Prairie, Arid Mesa, Grenzo Havoc Razor, Swords to Plowshares, Dam, and Necropotence. Last but not least, I am rocking Trostani, and I keep a Plains, Branchloft Pathway, Dryad Arbor, Harmonize, Arboreal Alliance, and Sun Titan. Chris wins the die roll and starts us off. He draws and plays Arid Mesa. I play a Dryad Arbor. Reese plays a Swamp and passes. Fred plays a Tap-Fetid Pools. Chris has a Rugged Prairie for turn, and he casts Boros Signet after tapping them. I draw and play a Plains. Reese has a Tainted Isle, and he taps 2 for Liquid Metal Torque. Fred draws and plays a tapped Hallowed Fountain. Chris has a Plains and pays 2 for Talisman of Conviction, and then double red for Grenzo Havoc Razor and passes to me. I just play a Scavenger Grounds and pass. Reese's main phase has one half of his commanders coming in with Malcolm, and he then plays a tapped Salt Marsh. Fred plays a Carplusion Forest, and then casts his commander, Jenson, taking 1 from tapping his lands for a color, and passes. Chris goes to combat on his turn, and he swings Grenzo at me, dealing 2 and exiling my top card. He casts it, which is a Halo Fountain, and then casts a Rakdos Signet and passes. I draw and play a Branchloft Pathway. I then mistakenly overpay for White Plume Adventurer, taking the initiative and going to find a basic from my library. Reese draws and plays a Swamp. He casts Academy Manufactor and then goes to combat. He swings Malcolm at me, dealing 2, and he takes the initiative, and he gains a treasure, a clue, and a food token. He searches up an island with the initiative trigger and passes. Fred draws and plays a mountain. He plays Explorer, drawing a card, and then playing Xander's Lounge as his extra land for turn. Chris draws, playing Queen Marchesa and becoming the monarch as she enters. He then goes to combat and swings Marchesa at Reese and Grenzo at Fred. Fred trades with Jenson with Grenzo, and Reese takes the 3 and loses the initiative. This has Chris gaining a Swamp, and he plays it and passes. I draw and play a Forest. I then cast Harmonize, drawing 3, and go to combat. I swing my White Plume Adventurer at Chris. Chris, however, uses my Hallowed Fountain to untap Queen Marchesa and makes a Citizen token and blocks with a Citizen. Unfortunately, without taking the Monarchy or Initiative, I just have to move to discard and pass. During my end step, Reese cracks a Clue token. Reese draws and plays an island. He goes to combat and swings Malcolm at Chris, taking the Monarchy and the initiative. He scries 2 from the initiative and gets a treasure, a clue, and a food token. In his post-combat main phase, Reese plays Nadier, and then moves to his end step, drawing from the Monarchy. Fred draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He then casts a Sliver Hivelord and cracks the Rainforest to find Spar's headquarters. Chris makes an Assassin token on his upkeep and draws. He goes to combat and swings the Assassin at Reese. Reese blocks with Nadier, and cracks a treasure token, which gives it a +1/+1 counter, and he then uses the mana to cast Supernatural Stamina. Nadier and the assassin trade, but Nadier comes back, and Reese also gets 6 elf tokens. After combat, Chris plays Austere Command, destroying all enchantments and small creatures, but Reese responds countering it with a Swan Song. Chris then passes, and during his end step, I cycle a Scattered Groves, drawing a card. I draw and play a Sungrass Prairie. I then cast Space Marine Devastator, copied once with Squad, and as it comes in, destroy the Academy Manufacturer and Liquid Metal Torque. With nothing else, I pass. Reese makes a treasure token with the Undercity and draws. He then plays a Swamp, and plays Curse of the Swine and targets the Sliver Hive Lord, cracking a treasure token, which puts a +1/+1 counter onto his commander. Going to combat, Reese swings Nadier at Fred and Malcolm at me. Fred blocks Nadier with the newly made pig token, and I take the hit, with Reese making a treasure token. After combat, Reese casts Beacon of Unrest and reanimates the Mirror Battlesphere, getting 4 Mirror tokens as it comes in. Fred draws and plays a Soul Ring. He then recasts Jenson and passes. Chris makes an Assassin, draws for turn, and plays Battlefield Forge. Going to combat, he swings the bird token at Reese and gets the Monarchy and Initiative back. This has him putting 2 +1/+1 counters onto his commander with the Undercity, and he then pays 3 black for Necropotence. He pays 5 life into it, and then moves to his end step, drawing the cards and drawing from being the Monarch at the end of turn. I draw for turn and cast Serra Emissary, choosing creatures as it comes in. I then move to combat and swing the Space Marine Devastator copy at Chris and the original and White Plume Adventurer at Reese. Before blocks though, Chris uses Swords to Plowshares and exiles Serra's Emissary, and then untaps a creature with the Halo Fountain, making a Citizen token. Chris blocks with his Death-Edging Assassin, and Reese is nice enough to double jump with 2 elves. With nothing else, I pass. Reese draws and isn't happy with it, casting Knight's Whisper to draw 2 and lose 2. He then plays Darkwater Catacombs and goes to combat. He swings Malcolm at me, and his elves and mirrors at Chris. I take 2, while Chris blocks 2 of them but takes the rest. This has Reese getting back the Monarchy and the Initiative, and he makes a 4/1 skeleton token from the Undercity. He also makes a treasure token off of Malcolm, and then plays a Merchant Scroll. This has him going to find a runaway together, which he puts to hand and passes. Fred draws and plays Last Stand, making a 4/4 Angel token off of Jenson. He deals 4 damage to Reese, 2 damage to Malcolm, creates 1 Saproling, gains 4 life, draws 4 cards, and discards 4 cards. He follows up with Kadama's Reach and passes. Chris makes an Assassin token on his upkeep, skips his draw, and in his main phase casts Jessica's Will. Since he has his commander, he exiles his top 3 and gets 5 red mana. He then plays a Mountain from exile. He then casts Sphere of Safety from hand, and then Solemnity from exile. He then moves to combat, swinging the bird token from Reese at Reese, who takes 2 and loses the Monarchy and the Initiative. This has Chris moving to the next room of the Undercity, and he goads Nadier. Chris then pays 4 life into Necropotence, and draws from the Monarchy as he puts the cards to hand during his end step. I draw and play Wood Elves, getting a Temple Garden which comes in tapped. I then play an Arboreal Alliance, putting X into the 0, and then cast Blade of Selves. After that, I pass, and during my end step, Reese casts Runaway together, targeting Nadier and Chris's bird token, and as Nadier leaves, he makes 8 more elf tokens. Reese draws and plays Chains of Vapor, targeting the Sphere of Safety, and Chris chooses not to copy it. Reese then replays Nadier, and he goes to combat. He swings 14 1/1s and the 4/1 skeleton token at Chris, who then casts Sudden Spoiling to turn them into 0/1s. Chris eats the skeleton and 2 other tokens, and takes a total of 0. Reese then passes after that. Fred draws and plays a Sacred Foundry untapped, taking 2. He plays Xyrus, and scries 1 from Jenson's ability. Going to combat, he swings the Angel at Chris, getting the Monarchy and the Initiative for the first time. He finds a basic from the Initiative, and then passes, drawing during his end step. Chris makes an assassin and skips his draw. He plays Disrupt Decorum and then a Goblin Sharpshooter. Chris then pays 5 life into Necropotence and he goes to combat. Before attacks, Fred casts Beast Within and targets the Sharpshooter. And Chris then decides to swing 2 assassins at Fred. Fred trades Jenson and his Saproling token to keep the Monarchy, and Chris then moves to his end step, getting the Necropotence cards and passing. I draw and equip the Wood Elves with the Blade of Selves. Going to combat, I swing my 3 goaded creatures at Reese, and make a Wood Elves token going at Fred and Kreese with Myriad. I then populate the Wood Elf token with Arboreal Alliance, and I get to find a total of 3 forests. Fred blocks his token, Chris blocks his, and Reese blocks the White Plume Adventurer with a Battle Sphere, and trades Nadier for the Adventurer. In my second main phase, I then cast Nesting Dovehawk, and I pass. Reese draws and goes to combat, swinging his board at me. I block 2 elf tokens, but take 19. In his post-combat main phase, Reese casts Solemn Simulacrum, finding an island, and passing. Fred scries 2 from the initiative and draws. He then plays Ruka Rumel, naming slivers as she comes in. He then plays a Sliver Legion and goes to combat. He swings the Angel at me and Xyrus at Reese. We each take our hits, and with the Xyrus trigger on the stack, Reese flashes in Notion Thief to steal most of the draws, and Fred gains 12 snake tokens. Fred then moves to his end step and goes to draw from being the Monarch, which instead gives Reese a draw, and Fred gets a snake token. Chris then casts Rakdos Charm and has each creature hit his controller for 1. Chris and I take 3, while Reese drops to 3 life and Fred drops to 19. Chris skips his draw step, makes an assassin token, and casts Kambal. He plays a Graven Cairns, and then puts 1 life into Necropotence, moves to his end step, and puts that card to hand. I draw and play a Staff of the Storyteller. I create a Spirit token as it comes in, and move to combat, populating my Wood Elf token thanks to the Dove. I then swing the Wood Elves at Chris, and the Dovehawk at Reese, making 2 more Wood Elf tokens from Myriad, and then populating one of them, finding a total of 4 forest cards. Reese blocks the Wood Elves with Solemn, and Chris and Fred block their Wood Elves as well. In my second main phase, I then play out Regal Behemoth, becoming the Monarch. I then cast Sun Titan, and bring back the White Plume Adventurer, and get back the initiative as well. We then move to my end step, with Reese drawing from my Monarch trigger, and Fred gets a snake token, and I pass. Reese draws and goes to combat. He swings out his elves at me, and I block as many as I can, but still take 7. This has Reese gaining the Monarchy again, and the initiative, and he finishes the Undercity. He reveals his top 10, and puts to field a Sphinx Summoner, with 3+1/+1 counters and temporary hexproof. The Summoner in turn goes to find him a Noxious Gearhulk, but he decides not to cast it, and just moves to the end step, drawing from being the Monarch. Fred draws and casts Painful Truths, putting 3 different types of mana into it, and forgetting about the Notion Thief, which has Reese drawing those cards. He also gets drained for 2 by Kambal. He then moves to combat, swinging his Angel token at Chris and his Snake tokens at Reese. Reese then cracks a Food token to gain 3 life, and casts Evacuation. This has him getting drained by Kambal for 2, but at least he saves himself from the creatures. After combat, Fred casts Atraxa, Praetor's Voice, and passes. Chris skips his draw and plays Caves of Koilos in his main phase. He then replays Sphere of Safety, and then Marchesa, and then Kambal. He becomes the Monarch again, and moving to combat, swings Marchesa at Reese to kill him, and takes the Monarchy and the initiative. This has Chris moving to the next room, and he makes a 4/1 skeleton token with the Undercity. He then pays 3 life into Necropotence, and passes to his end step, putting those cards to hand, and drawing from being the Monarch. I draw, and recast the Regal Behemoth, regaining the Monarchy. I then play Survival of the Fittest, and activate it, pitching Dryad Arbor for Elish Norn, Mother of Machines. We also remember that I take 2 from Kambal, and I then play Elish Norn. I follow her up with recasting the White Plume Adventurer, and get the initiative twice, goading Kambal and drawing a card. I then activate Survival again, discarding Birds of Paradise to find Reclamation Sage. I then cast it, and as it comes in, destroy the Sphere of Safety and Necropotence. Fred draws and replays Xyrus. He then goes to combat and takes me out with Atraxa and gets the monarchy and the initiative. This has Fred making a treasure token with the Undercity, and he passes. Chris makes an assassin and draws. He plays a demonic tutor in his main phase and goes to find a Custody Lich, and he casts it and becomes the monarch, and Fred sacrifices a creature. Chris then goes to combat and swings the skeleton at Fred, but Fred has an ink shield, fogging the damage and making 4 inkling tokens, but he does still get drained for 2 from Comball. Chris then moves to his end step, drawing from being the monarch. Fred draws and goes to combat. He swings back at Chris, but Chris is ready to play the reverse Uno card of Inkshield himself. This has Fred's combat step being fogged, and Chris gets to make 12 inkling tokens instead. Fred then casts the first sliver in his second main phase, and cascades into a Bloom Tender. He then replays the Sliver Legion, and cascades into a Supreme Verdict, which he casts. Fred does get drained from Comball after the board gets wiped, and with nothing else, Fred passes. Chris draws and plays a Spectator Seating, which actually enters tap for once. He then replays Queen Marchesa and swings her at Fred, but Fred responds with Path to Exile on her. In his post-combat main phase, Chris then plays out Arcane Signet and Mind Stone and draws from being the monarch and passes. Fred makes a skeleton token from the initiative and draws. He then plays Ramos and passes, with Chris flashing an Aven Mind Sensor during his end step. Chris draws and replays Queen Marchesa once more. He then passes, and during his end step, Fred casts an overloaded Cyclonic Rift, bouncing all of Chris's non-land permanents back to hand, and Chris also draws from being the monarch. Fred finishes the Undercity, and he reveals his top 10, getting Joda the Unifier off the trigger. He puts 3+1/+1 counters onto it, and it has temporary hexproof, and he then draws for turn. He then plays a Bloodstained Mire and casts Horde of Notions, putting 5+1/+1 counters onto Ramos. Joda's trigger flips him into an Arcane Signet, and Fred then moves to combat. He swings Ramos at Chris, and Chris responds with a Deflecting Palm to instead deal 9 to Fred's face. After that, Fred replays Rukarumel, putting 5 more counters onto Ramos, and he cascades into a Mana Cannons. He then passes after that. Chris draws and replays his Arcane Signet. He then casts Thought Vessel and draws from being the monarch as he passes turn. Fred draws and plays Jengatha, which cascades into an Assassin's Trophy, hitting the Arcane Signet. Chris then casts Reverberate, copying it and destroying Ramos. But Fred is ready, using Boros Charm to protect it, not to mention that Fred gets drained for a total of 4, while Chris gains 4 from Comball's triggers. Going to combat, Fred then swings out at Chris, but Chris is ready with a Settle the Wreckage. Fred's attackers get exiled, and he gets to go and find a bunch of basics. In his post-combat main phase, Fred then recasts Jenson, and he passes, with Chris once more flashing the Mind Sensor during his end step. Fred draws and plays Queen Marchesa again. He then goes to combat and swings all out at Fred, and Fred chumps Queen Marchesa with Jenson, dropping a 1. Chris completes the Undercity though, and flips into Xancha, which, as it comes in, is donated to Fred. Chris then just activates Xancha, dealing the last point of damage and taking the game. Game review time. This game was 2 hours, 20 minutes, and 15 seconds, and it was brain-meltingly long, plus the fact that basically by the end of it, this entire studio smelled like a brewery. I'll address the issue right off the bat. Technically, Fred cast a couple spells that weren't legendary from the Joda Cascades. By that point in the night, we were all so fried and just done with the game, we unfortunately overlooked it. Thankfully, it didn't change all that much, although he probably would have hit something different, but we're never going to know now. Beyond that, I think his Jenson deck played pretty well. He struggled early on, but that kind of worked in his favor since it meant that he wasn't a big threat. He didn't have to use a lot of his pieces or his removal, and he was able to save it for late game, which is what he used against Chris. Chris's deck was just absolutely controlling from the get-go. He seemingly had an answer for everything, and those back-to-back ink shields will live on in my memory forever. Unfortunately for Reese, I think he was the main bad guy early on. Everyone saw his massive token army, and it was just going to get worse and worse and worse. He had to be dealt with, and he was. Plus that Notion Thief was just obnoxious. My Trostani deck didn't do as much as I should have. Watching it back now, it's hard to say whether the Wood Elves or the White Plume Adventurer was the better target for the Blade of Selves. I think the first time around it probably made sense for the Wood Elves because it got me the lands, but the follow-up would have helped me power through the dungeon, which I think would have been more valuable than more lands. This video wouldn't be possible without the help from my sponsors, Cool Stuff Inc., Multizone, Original Magic Art, and Alter Sleeves. But it definitely wouldn't be possible without the help from you, the viewers, and my patrons. So I just want to say thank you for watching, and to remember, friends are just opponents you haven't eliminated yet.